Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Mind Can Benefit from Muscle Activation 2, the relationship between exercise and cognition. This is part of the webinar and telelearning series brought to you by National Multiple Sclerosis and the National MS Society. My name is Brian Thompson, Programs Manager for CanDo MS, and I will be your moderator for this evening. CanDo MS is an innovative provider of lifestyle and empowerment programs for people living with MS and their support partners. Through our programs, we empower people to manage their disease and move beyond their MS by adopting active and healthy lifestyles behaviors. Please visit the CanDo MS website, www.mscando.org, to learn more about CanDo MS's online and nationwide in-person programs. CanDo MS is excited to partner with the National MS Society to bring you 15 webinars in 2016. The mission of the National MS Society is to help people affected by MS live their best lives as they stop MS in its tracks, restore what has been lost, and end MS forever. Explore the Society's programs, services, resources, and connection opportunities at nationalms.org. I'm honored to introduce our two presenters this evening. Professor Robert Motl is a faculty member in the Department of Kinesiology and Community Health at the University of Illinois and director of the Exercise Neuroscience Research Laboratory. Over the past 10 years, Professor Motl has worked with the National MS Society to spearhead comprehensive research focusing on the effects of MS on the central nervous system. And Mandy Rohrig received her doctorate of physical therapy from the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Mandy is a therapist at Horizon Rehabilitation Centers in Omaha, where she specializes in the rehabilitation of individuals with multiple sclerosis and other neurological conditions. Nationally, Mandy serves on the National MS Society's Professional Resource Center and Content Advisory Team and has been a program consultant for CanDo MS since 2007. Before I turn things over to Rob and Mandy, our objectives this evening, we will be looking to identify the causes and effects of cognitive challenges and understand how they are impacted by multiple sclerosis, recognize how physical activity affects cognition, implement exercises that address cognitive symptoms and improve overall brain health, and connect research related to exercise and cognition with practical real-life applications. So at this time, it's my honor to turn things over to Robert and Mandy.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you, Brian, for the introduction, and thank you to CanDo MS, and thank you to the National MS Society, as well as my co-presenter, Rob, and all of you for joining us this evening for this conversation. So welcome. So we'll dive right in, and we'll start with what are some common cognitive challenges? What are cognitive issues? Cognitive issues involve impaired processing speed. And that may be slowed speed of thought, maybe difficulty keeping up with conversations. It may be impaired working memory. And this may be especially notable when you're alternating your attention between two ideas, or kind of just that general cognitive flexibility that we have to have when we're doing multiple things at one time. It could be impaired learning or memory. And primarily this is our storage or retrieval of memories, specifically events are what are most common, like remembering when your doctor's appointment is. It can also be impaired executive function, which involves more of your organization, your prioritizing, sequencing, perhaps a little reasoning. And lastly, it could also involve visual spatial processing, so maybe difficulty reading maps or difficulty navigating while you're driving. But what we know it is not is just that general forgetfulness, like, hey, where did I leave my glasses? So we want you to start thinking about, as we're introducing this concept of cognition, start thinking about some of the own challenges that you might have when you're in your daily life with relationship to cognitive challenges.
Alrighty, and at this time you'll see a polling question in front of you, and we encourage you to go ahead and let us know what cognitive challenges you face. And this will be a great introduction to our conversation here to find out what you at home are facing with MS. So you can click on more than one answer, and then when you're ready you can click submit, and in a minute we'll go to the results and we'll see exactly what kind of cognitive issues we're dealing with out there. as we have just over 100 results coming in. It looks like processing speed is certainly a big issue along with memory. And we have over 200 results coming in, so we'll give it another couple seconds here. Alrighty. So as you see,
but
processing
clearly,
speed.
Yeah, clearly a tremendous challenge, though, across the board.
All right, thank you for participating, everyone. And when we're ready, we can move on to the next slide.
Okay. So some of you, I suspect, have heard or unfortunately or fortunately participated in the Paced Auditory Serial Addition Test. This is an example of a type of clinical cognitive test that we as healthcare providers may do to assess your cognitive function. And how this works, and I hope this diagram is helpful, how this works is a single digit is presented every 3 seconds. So for example, the number 3 is presented, and then 3 seconds later the number 2 is presented, and then the patient or the client is expected to add each new digit to the one immediately prior. And the final result is the total number of correct out of the 60 that are offered. So as you can imagine, this is pretty challenging, especially when it's happening every 3 seconds, and in some instances it can be every 2 seconds. So clearly a very challenging test. And Rob, can you tell us a bit more perhaps about the prevalence of cognitive issues and how often tests like this might be done in the clinic?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think oftentimes clinicians are doing lots of different assessments of cognitive functioning as part of their clinical practice. And I think they're doing this because patients more and more are realizing that they have lots of different cognitive problems. And one of the things I was just noticing is I was looking at the graph of the figure of the poll of the cognitive challenges that people were reporting, and they almost perfectly mimic this figure on the slide now. And what this is it's a figure showing the degree of cognitive impairments in persons with multiple sclerosis compared to individuals from the general population who don't have multiple sclerosis. And what you'll see is across the board, there are impairments in cognitive functioning. People with MS are performing worse than individuals from the general population. And these effects are fairly moderate in magnitude. And so what this means is that more and more we're realizing that cognitive impairment is an important thing to monitor in clinical practice, and more we need to understand the pathological features of multiple sclerosis that lead to these cognitive problems in MS. We increasingly are learning that areas of the brain that are deteriorating with multiple sclerosis are directly associated with the cognitive problems. So, for instance, there's research out of the University of Buffalo that shows one area of the brain called the thalamus, which you can see in this figure right here, is deteriorated in MS, and it is directly related to the slowing of cognitive processing speed. So what that tells us is this one area of the brain in particular that is a major relay area in the brain is its deterioration is leading to the slowing of cognitive processing speed. Another area of the brain that we study oftentimes is the hippocampus, and that is a Latin word for seahorse. And that area of the brain seems to be particularly important for learning and memory, which is another area or cognitive domain that many people with multiple sclerosis experience problems with. And this is an area that we see deterioration with advancing multiple sclerosis that is directly associated with learning and memory problems. We also look at the frontal and prefrontal cortex of the brain. And these areas are important because they're associated with what we call executive control problems. And I saw a question pop up on what is executive control. Well, executive control is essentially trying to do two cognitive tasks or more simultaneously. So you're trying to process information and one cognitive stimulus while you're also attending to another cognitive stimulus. And this is oftentimes akin to trying to drive in a car and have a conversation at the same time. And we know that this region of the brain is associated with impaired executive control and that its deterioration is directly leading to that. And lastly, we know that the connectivity of many of these different regions is associated with the general cognitive declines that we see in people with multiple sclerosis. So what this is telling us is that we know more and more at the brain level what is causing the cognitive problems in persons with multiple sclerosis. And that's important because that will begin to understand or tell us what areas we need to target through intervention to try to improve cognitive functioning. But as Mandy will talk about now, cognitive problems are a major life event for people with MS.
Absolutely. So sometimes the consequences of what Rob just explained, what's going on in the brain, are significant functional challenges in daily life. It may range from employment issues, activities of daily living, or ADL issues, challenges with walking, driving, communication, and then you guys might have some others that you would like to add as well. Commonly in the clinic, employment is interfered by cognitive challenges because it's difficult to organize and prioritize details of a daily work responsibility, a daily work schedule. Similarly, ADLs, or activities of daily living, may be challenging just simply preparing a meal or following a recipe. Walking and talking, maybe walking and doing more than one activity at a time. Driving, so driving following a map or listening to some type of navigation system can be compromised if you have a lot of cognitive challenges as well. And lastly, communication. And I think this is perhaps what I hear the most as a physical therapist in the clinic, is that communication is compromised when there are cognitive issues. The most recent example I can think of is a client of mine who has MS, and she has a teenage daughter who comes home and after school and is just talking 1,000 miles an hour so fast about everything that's happened during her day, and then her needs for the evening and the needs for the weekend. And my client always says, I forget what my daughter says, and she gets angry and frustrated. And so they kind of resolved and compromised by the strategy that they developed was the daughter sends text messages to her mother prior to coming home so the mom can start processing it prior. And then the daughter still comes home and communicates it verbally. But that gives the mother time to store it and then hear it again. And certainly children, particularly teenagers, don't mind text messaging, so it's not too much of an inconvenience for her either. Rob, do you have any clinical stories that you would like to share?
No, I think that those are the same things that we hear on a regular basis in the research lab when we talk about designing studies to improve cognitive functioning. People get really excited about that because they talk about the importance of maintaining and improving their cognition for employment, for doing activities of daily living. That's what ADLs are, which one person asked about. Walking, driving, communicating. These are essential things that we can improve if we can improve cognition.
So what are some solutions, Rob? What can we do to help manage these cognitive challenges?
Yeah, and that's the million-dollar question right now. So there have been lots of research studies looking at medications to improve cognition, and so far those studies have been less than desirable. There's a lot of research looking at cognitive rehabilitation. That is trying to teach people strategies to help them deal with everyday cognitive problems. Or other studies are doing cognitive rehabilitation that presumably helps to remodel the brain of individuals. And those seem to be generating some positive results. Physical therapy, of course, and the big question and the big discussion tonight is what about the role of of exercise. And so we know that exercise has many, many benefits for persons with multiple sclerosis. This is a figure that my colleague and I published in the journal Nature a few years ago, wherein we summarized all the literature looking at exercise training and lifestyle physical activity and its effects in people with MS, from looking at pathogenic processes through the structure of the central nervous system, through mental, cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, and sensory problems, to activities of daily living and participation, including recreation, leisure, and work. And what the data told us is that there are a lot of interesting effects looking at physical activity and exercise on things like one's aerobic capacity, one's muscle strength, their balance, their gait, or the underlying mechanisms of walking. There are also a lot of data on exercise effects on fatigue and depression. And then we also looked at walking performance, and data suggests that if you engage in exercise and physical activity, it can improve your walking, and that these changes in turn can improve quality of life, activities of daily living, and other outcomes. But the one outcome you'll notice that I didn't talk about in this list is cognition. And what we found at that point in time is that we needed to take a deeper look at cognition. We needed to know a little bit more about the subject of exercise and cognition. So a few years later, with one of my graduate students, Brian Sandroff, and Ralph Benedict, who's a professor at the University of Buffalo, we really delved carefully into the exercise and cognition literature. And we wanted to develop a rationale that would get individuals to, and when I say individuals, I mean researchers, interested in examining the potential of exercise training for cognition and multiple sclerosis. And so we developed this initial platform and this initial proposal to generate excitement, to generate momentum and enthusiasm, and we've learned quite a bit from that period of time. We will talk a little bit more about this when we review the research on exercise or the proposition for exercise and neuroprotection, which I think Mandy will talk about next.
So this is all very exciting, right? So this is a diagram, but I think more of a conceptual model is how it's described, exemplifying all of the benefits of exercise. And it can range from functional benefits, which is what we're commonly more accustomed to hearing about, and also includes brain health as well as immunomodulation types of things. But I think, again, is what is most notable and exciting about this diagram is the profound effect that exercise can have on a wide variety of areas of our health and overall well-being and quality of life. However, since today's conversation is primarily about exercise and cognition, we wanted to just focus on that highlighted area, the parts that circled there, all of those neuroprotection, neuroregeneration, neurogenesis, and neuroplasticity. So let's go ahead and define those. So neuroprotection is, in essence, the preservation of nervous structures or function, so neurons. And it kind of suggests an overall reduction in the rate of neuron loss or nerve loss over time. Neuroregeneration now is what we describe as the regrowth or repair of neurons. Nervous tissues are, again, some of their related products. This can include axons. It can include myelin. It can include some synapses, among many other parts within our nervous system. Neurogenesis now, the third bullet point, is the creation of new neurons or nerves. And then lastly, neuroplasticity is the kind of just a all-encompassing term for the nervous system's ability to change. So it's the changeability. It can be very small scale on an individual neuron, or it can be very large scale, such as brain reorganization or cortical reorganization. And we can get these neuroplastic changes in response to behavior, environmental stimulus, or what we're talking about here today, exercise. So all really exciting stuff. So Rob, can you tell us in greater detail exactly how exercise is changing our brains. How can we get a fit brain like the one here in this picture?
Yeah, that's what we all want, isn't it? So I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to try to be as reduce the scientific terminology as much as I can. And the data that I'm going to talk about has a lot to do with the study of exercise and older adults. And the reason this is so important is twofold. One is that that's where the majority of research studying exercise and cognition has taken place. The other reason that this is important is oftentimes individuals or scientists and researchers, as well as clinicians, think of MS as a model of accelerated aging. So when we talk about exercise and aging, a lot of what we're going to talk about may actually apply quite well in persons with MS. So the first study that I'm going to talk about is the study conducted at the University of Illinois by Art Kramer. And what they did is they enrolled a large number of previously sedentary older adults. These were individuals who were 60 to 75 years of age, and they enrolled 124 of them in this study. These older adults were randomly assigned into one of two conditions, and both conditions lasted for 6 months. One of the conditions was aerobic exercise training, and this involved walking around a track inside of a gymnasium in small groups of individuals and with exercise leaders present. The other group was a non-aerobic exercise stimulus. This involved group-based, in a gym, stretching and light strengthening exercises. And these researchers examined the effect of these two exercise conditions on cognitive performance. And they looked at cognitive performance based on how fast someone could respond to different stimuli. They looked at how fast you could respond when just a simple dot was pressed on the screen versus how fast you could respond when you had to perform more complicated cognitive tasks where you're switching between two different things at the same time. And so what they showed in the study is first and foremost that the aerobic fitness levels of the individuals who walked improved. And those who did the stretching and toning actually had a slight decrease in their aerobic fitness. But what's most notable is shown in this figure to the right on the screen. And what you have here is you have data for the walking or the aerobic exercise condition, and on the right-hand side you have data for what they call the stretching and strengthening or toning condition. And when you look at the simple reaction time task, you see that both groups had faster reaction time from before to after either aerobic exercise or the non-aerobic exercise. And this suggests a general effect of engaging in physical activity in improving the speed in which the brain can process information. Now, what was most important from this study has to do with the more complicated task, and that's illustrated in the light blue and the dark blue. And what these researchers show here is a selective effect of aerobic exercise training. That is, aerobic exercise training resulted in a large, statistically significant improvement in reaction time in response to a cognitive task that required lots of brain resources, in other words, lots of brain power. So what that means is that aerobic exercise is able to particularly improve cognitive functioning that are most demanding and necessary for everyday life. Now, this paper is noteworthy for two reasons. One is this is the first paper I'm aware of that's ever been published on exercise and psychological outcomes by the journal Nature. And secondly, this study was picked up by Saturday Night Live for its session on Weekend Update, where the Saturday Night Live comedian said researchers at the University of Illinois have recently shown that exercise improves cognitive functioning. And then they flipped to a slide of then President George W. Bush walking and said there are some exceptions. Now, taking this a step further, these are data from a very prominent meta-analysis looking at the effects of exercise training versus a control condition on different types of cognitive functioning. And I think the easiest way to say this is that this executive is the most demanding cognitive functioning. This requires a lot of brain power. In the middle, you have controlled and spatial. These are moderately demanding cognitive functions. And then at the very end, you have speed, which is the most simplistic cognitive functioning. And what this very important paper showed is that exercise training had its largest effects on tasks that required the most cognitive performance, that were the most difficult for individuals to perform. It showed middle level effects on those things that were moderately challenging to perform, and it showed the smallest effects on those cognitive tasks that were the easiest to perform. So what this study shows is that the more demanding the cognitive tasks that people undertake, the greater the effect of exercise and physical activity in older adults. Now, what this has prompted is a lot of interest in why in the world does exercise improve cognition? And so what we've been studying more and more is exercise effects on gray and white matter volumes in the aging brain. And we know as people age, they preferentially lose tissue in the frontal cortex, the temporal cortex, and the parietal cortex. And these are areas of the brain that are strongly associated with cognitive control. They also lose white matter that allows the two hemispheres to connect, or the corpus callosum. And what data have been showing is that older adults who engage in high volumes of exercise actually have an increase in the tissue, the neuron, in the prefrontal cortex, the temporal cortex, and the parietal cortex. And they also have an increase in the connections between the different hemispheres, or the corpus callosum. So what these data are suggesting is that exercise can improve and reduce age-related declines in gray and white matter that underlie cognitive functions in people with MS. So that's amazing, that exercise could actually slow and reverse tissue loss with aging. Because it used to be thought that when you lost tissue in the brain, you could never restore it. So one of the things that we've tried to understand is why biologically does this occur? And more we know that exercise releases chemicals in the brain that actually promote this nerve growth. And these chemicals are called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factors. These are essentially nutrients that are released into the brain that improve brain health. And let me show you a little data on this. These are the initial data looking at the effects of exercise on the expression of BDNF in animals. And you have to do this in animals because there aren't a lot of humans in the world who will exercise and then donate their brain for sectioning and staining of areas of the brain to look at this. That's why you have to turn to animals. And what you see here is the area of the brain called the hippocampus. And you'll remember earlier we talked about this area of the brain being important for learning and memory functions. And this is the hippocampus of an animal that ran on a wheel. And this is the hippocampus of an animal that didn't engage in any physical activity and that was essentially sedentary. And I think if you look at these, you see very robust differences. There is a lot more red and yellow, and it's staining in here indicating a greater expression of BDNF in the brain. When we look at this middle graph, we see that animals that exercise had nearly a twofold increase in this nerve growth factor in the brain compared to the sedentary animals. And lastly, what we know is the more running that is occurring on a daily basis shows greater and greater and greater increases in these nerve growth factors in the brain. So we know that exercise is improving cognition by improving the structure and function of the brain, and that's occurring through the regulation of neurotropic factors. The last thing to talk about is how in the world does exercise upregulate this BDNF thing that affects the brain? And this was a recent study in the journal Cell Metabolism that showed that exercise actually produces, when you exercise and you contract a muscle, it actually produces these what we call regulatory proteins and molecules that are released in the blood. And it causes the release of another neurochemical that can circulate in the blood and get into the brain. And when it gets into the brain, it actually causes the upregulation or expression of BDNF in the hippocampus, and that results in nerve cell survival, differentiation, and plasticity results, which results in cognition and learning and memory. Now, the most interesting part of this study is that if you just take this protein here and you inject it into animals without them engaging in any exercise, it does the exact same thing. So exercise actually serves as a stimulus for this protein regulation that results in BDNF, or nerve growth, or nutrient factors in the brain that promote these wonderful benefits in aging. Now, the last thing I want to point out is that these results are not limited to older adults. This is a recent paper that involved an exercise training study in individuals with schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is a disease that we are all well aware of. But one of the things that we oftentimes don't understand in schizophrenia is that there are severe memory and learning impairments, and that is directly linked with deterioration of the hippocampus, or the brain region we've been talking about with learning and memory. And so these researchers recently did a very, very nice study, and they looked at the effects of exercise in persons with schizophrenia versus no exercise. And what they reported is that the people with schizophrenia who engaged in exercise had a substantial increase in learning and memory, so they were better able to do learning and memory tasks. And they also showed a significant increase in the volume of the hippocampus. And that's what's shown in this figure right here, that there's an increase in the volume of the hippocampus in those with schizophrenia who engage in exercise. And then they took these MRI pictures, which we've all seen before, and they've shown that in these MRI pictures that they were able to show an increase in the volume of the hippocampus with these individuals who have schizophrenia. So why is this important? Because now we're moving from exercise and its effects on cognition and brain health in older adults into individuals who have a disease of the brain and the central nervous system. So it's bringing us one step closer to studying and understanding the effects of exercise on the brain of persons with multiple sclerosis. So what we want to do now is move into what we know about exercise and MS when it comes to cognition. And one of the things that I really, really want you to know is that we're on a big journey. We're on a long journey, because I think exercise can help us solve a lot of the cognitive problems in MS, but we've just begun this foray. And so what I'm going to talk about is research looking at exercise and fitness and its improvements in cognition in persons with multiple sclerosis. And then secondly, talk about the data showing that exercise and fitness are associated with better brain health in persons with multiple sclerosis. This is going to be our agenda to get us moving to improve our cognition and brain health. So one of the first things that my research group has done is to study the relationship between different types of fitness, whether that's aerobic fitness or muscular strength fitness, and its association with different domains of cognitive functioning. So we have individuals do tests of their aerobic capacity. We call that VO2 max, or maximal aerobic power. And that's a real good indication of how much aerobic exercise people have been doing. And then we also assess the strength, the maximum amount of force that someone could exert of the leg muscles. And we examined how those variables were associated with cognitive processing speed, as well as visual and verbal memory in persons with multiple sclerosis. And one of the things that we found is that individuals who were more aerobically fit had better cognitive processing speed. That's what CPS stands for. That is, individuals who were able to generate more aerobic power and were more highly trained, in other words, had engaged in more aerobic exercise, had better cognitive processing speed on the symbol-digit modalities test. The other thing we noticed is that individuals who also were able to generate more muscular force, in other words, they had stronger leg muscles from engaging in muscle strength training, also had better cognitive processing speed. That's what CPS stands for, is cognitive processing speed, based on the symbol-digit modalities test. So what we're showing in this first study here is that aerobic training and muscle strength training might be very, very important for improving the domain of cognitive processing speed. And the important thing to remember is that's the most impaired domain of cognition in persons with multiple sclerosis. The next study that we looked at was the relationship between physical activity. So not just looking at how fit you were and how much you engaged in aerobic exercise, but now trying to look at just how physically active you were. Are you moving more during daily life as part of your daily life? And these are very complicated scatter plots, but what they're both showing is that individuals with multiple sclerosis who engage in higher and higher volumes of physical activity also have better and better and better cognitive processing speed, and we see the exact same thing for learning and memory. So now what this is telling us is that it's not just engaging in aerobic exercise or resistance exercise, but just engaging in physical activity as part of your everyday life is beneficial for improving cognition in individuals with multiple sclerosis. Now, one of the last studies I want to talk about is looking at physical activity and its relationship to brain health. And what I want to note most importantly is in this column right here. This is looking at physical activity that is moderate to vigorous in intensity. This is going outside and walking for 10 minutes at a time at roughly 2 miles per hour. And what we show in this slide here is that individuals who engage in a greater number of minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day have larger gray matter in the brain, and gray matter is the density of neurons in the brain. They have more white matter. White matter is the myelination or the axons or the myelinated axons in the brain. So individuals who engage in more moderate to vigorous physical activity in their whole brain have better neurons and myelination. We also show that they have a better or higher density of neurons in the hippocampus, which is an area associated with learning and memory, higher density in the thalamus, which is an area associated with cognitive processing speed, as well as the caudate, putamen, and pallidum. These are areas that are associated with the control of movement or walking that can be greatly affected by cognition. And so the most important thing to take from this is that physical activity and exercise are improving cognition, and they're improving the health of the brain in people with multiple sclerosis, specifically areas of the brain associated with cognitive processing. So from here, we have started to look at randomized controlled trials of exercise training and its effects on cognition in persons with multiple sclerosis. And one of the first studies that was done was published in Neurology in 2004. And this was a study done at the Oregon Health Sciences University by Barry Oken with other prominent researchers, particularly Dennis Bourdet. And what they looked at is the effects of engaging in yoga 1 day a week versus aerobic exercise on 1 day a week, and its effects on a host of cognitive domains in persons with MS. Now, unfortunately, this study was unsuccessful. That is, the individuals who engaged in yoga or aerobic exercise training did not have improvements in any domain of cognitive functioning. And so it really left a kind of wet blanket feeling for much of the MS community relative to the effects of exercise. But what we realized when we looked at this study very carefully is that the exercise that was done was not done sufficiently relative to the large body of research in older adults. And so it's likely that the study didn't work because the exercise wasn't done properly. And that's something that Mandy's going to talk a lot about in the next segment of this program. And the way we know this is one of the more recent studies that's been published in the Multiple Sclerosis Journal that comes out of Europe. And in this study, they looked at the effects of exercise on fitness and cognition in persons with progressive multiple sclerosis. And what they showed in this study is that exercise was effective for improving cognitive functioning in persons with MS. And the reason I think this study was so able to show that is the exercise itself was done in a very highly efficient way. And it's important to note that this was just 8 to 10 weeks of exercise that was all aerobic in nature, so aerobic exercise improved cognition. The other thing I want to point out, because I've seen a lot of chatter to the side, is that the aerobic exercise wasn't just walking exercise. It involved riding a bicycle, so upright riding or seated riding of a bicycle as an aerobic exercise stimulus. It involved rowing on a rowing machine, and it also involved arm ergometry or pedaling a bike with your arms. All three of these types of aerobic exercise were capable of improving cognition in people with MS. And this is very important because it allows more individuals to effectively engage in exercise to improve cognitive functioning. Now, I know I've talked a lot about research, but let me talk about the last study. This is a very exciting case study that came out of the Kessler Foundation by Jim Samowski and Victoria Levitt. And what they did is they very specifically looked at aerobic exercise and its effects on memory in people with MS and whether that could be explained by changes in the volume of the hippocampus. And what this study effectively showed is that if you take individuals with multiple sclerosis and you have them engage in aerobic exercise training, you can increase the volume of the hippocampus, that area of the brain that is important for learning and memory, and that translates into improved memory in persons with multiple sclerosis. And in this case, this was relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. So what I'm trying to do for you here is to build the case that there's lots of evidence in older adults. There's some evidence in other conditions like schizophrenia, and we are building this evidence in persons with multiple sclerosis. And the preliminary evidence right now is suggesting that exercise might be the one form of rehabilitation you can count on to improve cognitive functioning in MS, and that works by improving the structure and function of the brain. So from there, I'm going to let Mandy kind of take over the research to real life to you discussion.
Great work, Rob. If that information doesn't make everyone more enthusiastic about trying to exercise and trying to make changes to our nervous system, I don't know what can. So thank you, Rob. So make no mistake, guys, this is a picture of Rob at work, and this is a picture of me at the gym, clearly. But no, what we want to make a point now is to take all of this information that we have learned from the research and start applying it to real life and start applying it to your situations, which a lot of questions have been going on, conversations and going on in the chat about how to start applying this. So exercising your body changes your mind. Why and how? How can we make this happen? So the components of an exercise program, the first one is flexibility. And there are some examples of some different types of flexibility exercises. Strength and endurance, so that may include weightlifting, resistance band, Pilates, balance and coordination types of exercises, which can include Tai Chi, yoga, or vestibular exercises. And we'll talk a little bit more about vestibular exercises in a bit. And lastly, cardiopulmonary or aerobic types of exercises. So these 4 components are different areas of exercise that you could participate in. Now some forms of these have been well supported by research, like Rob had alluded to, aerobic exercise, specifically to improve cognition. However, others have not. Now this doesn't devalue them, and it doesn't mean that we're not encouraging you to participate in those other types of exercise, but we just don't have the evidence right now to support them for helping you with cognitive issues. So when we talk about prescribing exercise and making recommendations for exercise, I like to use the FIT principle, and this is frequency, intensity, time or duration, and lastly type, or what type of exercise is most appropriate. And that last point, the specificity or the type of exercise, I really want to emphasize. You want to make sure you're doing exercises that are helping you achieve a desired goal. We don't want you doing, for example, say you want to walk better. I don't want you spending your energy doing exercises, bicep curls. You know, you have limited energy because of MS. We want to make sure that the exercises that you're putting your energy towards are giving you some bang for your buck, if you will. So now we're going to start talking about each category of exercise and briefly discuss some kind of highlights of the research and then talk about some general recommendations or how you can apply that to your real life. So flexibility exercises first. I kind of emphasized yoga a bit here. So yoga, 20 minutes may be helpful, but it's not as helpful as walking. So again, this implies that need for aerobic exercise in order to improve cognition. The second point discusses yoga may have minimal effect in this one particular study, and actually in a couple studies, but it seems to help improve fatigue. So one could question or reason that if your cognitive decline is secondary to or associated with some fatigue that you might have, then maybe yoga would be a really great option for you. Lastly, yoga may influence attention performance, and that's kind of exciting that maybe that can help improve your concentration. So taking that information and translating it to real life, yoga might be helpful. Stretching exercises might be helpful. We recommend doing flexibility exercises, particularly if you're somebody who has spasticity, which is spasticity is that resistance to movement, that tightness, that muscle guarding, that cramping that you might get. We recommend it daily, sometimes more than once a day, at an intensity on average of 2 to 3 repetitions, and you hold it for anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds. Now again, all of these recommendations are very general, generic. I highly, highly recommend that you consult with a physical therapist so they can help identify what activities, again, you need to be putting your energy towards and what muscle groups need the most attention. So, again, researcher Rob, with all of his volume and lovely hair, and me with my toned biceps and triceps, how can we translate some of this flexibility information into real life? Some exercise ideas. Now in the spirit of the political season, I incorporated this cartoon. Today we are going to learn how to take our foot out of our mouth. It's the politician's yoga club. But in all seriousness, here are some good resources. The National MS Society has a couple manuals. NCPAD, which actually stands for the National Center on Health, Physical Activity, and Disability. That organization has some good videos and online images of some flexibility exercises. The MS Trust out of the UK has some good online videos. And also, again, there are many, many options online if accessibility or getting out of your home is often a challenge, and it just gives you some variety as well. But again, emphasizing the importance of consulting with a PT prior to engaging in a flexibility program. Anyone else have any ideas that they want to include? I'll kind of watch the chat box for a second. But I think the key is finding what works for you and finding those muscles that need the most attention.
Yeah, and I think, Mandy, it might be good to kind of talk a little bit about, how to know when stretching is too much stretching. You know what I mean by that? Because sometimes people stretch and they push stretching a little too far. Do you have some advice on how to know when you're pushing it enough but not overdoing it?
Great question. So that's a great question. This is variable, and I would say it depends upon the person, but I think a good rule of thumb is that no pain, no gain theory does not apply. So if a stretching activity is painful, then it's too much. Sometimes folks with spasticity might feel kind of a catch and then a release as they're stretching. That can be a somewhat normal sensation. But again, working with that therapist will kind of help you learn your body in a different way and find out the appropriate amount of range of motion to push. Good question. And I just saw a question about getting overheated, and I think that's important to just touch on. We'll touch on it a little bit later, but there are many, many cooling products out there, and I do encourage trying to keep your core body temperature down and at a consistent level, because that will help with your overall exercise performance regardless of the type of exercise you're doing. Okay, moving on to strength training. So some of the research is indicating, and most of this is actually, again, in the elderly population. So the research articles that I'm highlighting here is that 1 to 2 times a week, high intensity free weights and machine weightlifting improved cognition in these elderly women. And what's interesting is this was only 2 sets of 6 to 8 repetitions. So folks who have limited mobility, limited energy, limited in their overall mobility or their ability to participate in exercise can still make some improvements in cognition. This particular article would suggest if we can translate it to folks with MS. And even more interesting is, again, 2 years later, an MRI follow-up of the same group of folks showed less brain atrophy and improved executive function and memory. So this is positive for the world of folks who are older. However, to my knowledge, and Rob, chime in, there's no known research supporting resistant training to treat cognition for people with MS. Is that correct?
Not yet.
Not yet. So Rob has a job to do.
Yeah, I feel bad to say those sorts of things. Not yet, because the one thing with strength training is it seems like it should work. And it's one of the things I think a lot of people think should work, but it just hasn't been systematically examined. And the reason for that is because many of the initial researchers in the world of aging have assumed that there's something very, very unique and specific about aerobic exercise and its ability to increase brain blood flow and brain oxygenation and get a lot of these changes in the brain. And I think because of that assumption, we've paid less attention to resistance exercise. But I definitely think coming around the corner, you'll see a lot of research on resistance exercise in a lot of populations, including MS and its effects on the brain and cognition.
Absolutely. We hope so. We'll be watching for those. So thank you, Rob. So those recommendations for real life or how you could implement a strength training program, I won't go through each one of those bullet points in detail, but again, general guidelines that we could recommend if you wanted to start engaging in an exercise program for strength training. Again, I would emphasize though, before engaging, talk to a PT, help them prioritize those exercises that will give you the most benefit and give you the most result for your effort. So translating that research, translating that information, you see Muscular Mandy again, she's back in the gym. How can we move this towards you? Here's some strength training ideas. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these images, the bodybuilding, the big weights, plates, probably less likely to use among folks with MS if mobility is a challenge. So maybe resistance bands are more appropriate, or using your own body resistance. And actually the upper right-hand corner picture is a picture of kind of like a curves setup or a circuit training. And often circuit training will alternate between resistance training and aerobic exercise. So this is kind of just me as the therapist thinking, if that kind of need for aerobic exercise is suggested or seems to improve cognition, maybe a circuit environment that alternates between aerobics and weight training might be a better option. Maybe, maybe not. Rob, I guess we'll find out, right?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. I do think that one of the things to add to this is that we're more and more designing, and this is where I say we'll find out about this soon. We've been working on designing home-based strength training programs for people with multiple sclerosis, where we have a manual and a DVD, but we also give these lovely resistance bands, and we teach people how to do these exercises and then have them do them in their home. And so we've first been working on how do we effectively do this? How do we give people the right equipment and get them to do it in their home? And once we get done with that, we're going to start looking at this as a way of improving lots of different outcomes, including cognition. And this is part of the study that we call GEMS, if people are interested. And we've recently published the protocol paper, so you can find it by probably searching through Google for Project GEMS, Guidelines for Exercise in MS.
Nice. Okay, we'll move on. So we've discussed briefly flexibility. We've talked a little bit about strength training. Now let's move on to balance. So balance, I kind of like to think of as a therapist, we think of this as the sixth sense. And this is a nice little model of all of the systems that balance, all of the parts of our body that balance uses to help us stay steady and help us stay upright. So there are kind of two primary subcategories. There are motor systems, so the musculoskeletal system. So this is the muscles, the strength and the flexibility required to stay balanced. And then the neuromuscular aspect, which is the coordination and the timing of those muscles. The second part of this is more of the sensory aspect. So this involves the eyes, the inner ear, and then the touch or pressure sensation organs that we get from our feet and from our joints. And that's called somatosensation, but that's not necessary to know that word. It's just that sense of touch. It's those muscles and nerves in our legs. And that message being sent to the brain about our balance. So eyes, ears, and then the muscles and nerves in our legs. So all day, every day, all of these systems are working together to keep us upright. So an example of kind of how this works is, say you're walking on plush carpet. Plush carpet can kind of skew the information that the touch sensors are getting and sending to our brain. So the other two systems have to raise their level of function to compensate for that deficit. Similarly, who doesn't get up in the middle of the night sometimes to go to the bathroom? Say you're walking on that same plush carpet, can't use those muscles and nerves in the legs and that sensation as well for balance. You can't use your vision as well for balance because it's darker or dim light, so you become more reliant on the inner ear, or you find other compensatory ways. So balance is very dynamic. Balance is very complex. But the one key thing that I haven't mentioned is the influence of the brain. So, and the brain's ability to help with multitasking as we are balancing. So let's talk a little bit more about the brain influence on balance. So what does the research say? A personalized balance program shows greater improvement than a traditional kind of a gym-based exercise program for people with MS. And again, this just kind of demonstrates the complexity of balance and that you often need to engage those professionals to help dissect and kind of problem solve with you what areas of balance needs the most attention. We can't just cherry pick one area without kind of knowing for certain that that area is the one that needs the most attention. Vestibular exercises are exercises that involve the inner ear. These often involve a lot of eye exercises and a lot of gaze stabilization exercises. Those types of exercises have been known to improve walking and standing balance and really reduce fatigue. And again, to our knowledge, there's no research in people with MS on the effect of balance training on cognition. However, balance function has been found to be associated with cognition, and I'm going to let Rob interject and elaborate a little more about this association.
Yeah, so that was a very, very early finding from our lab when we started looking at different types of function and their relationship with cognition, wherein we showed that individuals, when they stand upright and they sway a lot more, and the more you sway or your body moves back and forth, the poorer your balance. That was directly related to cognitive processing speed in particular. And so what it suggests is that if we improve balance, we can improve cognitive processing speed. And probably the part of that is that when you're swaying like that, you have to spend so much of your cognitive processes on staying upright that it is hard to do cognitive tasks efficiently and effectively. So, and we all know that balance is something you can improve if you get a good program. So it should improve cognition, I would think.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when you want to get that program, again, it's highly individualized. So again, I would encourage consulting with a PT who can help you dissect the challenges that you specifically might have. So as we've alluded to already, balance is highly individualized. It's very complex, which is why there are so many balance exercises to consider. Unfortunately, and the PT profession is guilty of this, there's a disconnect between how we prescribe balance exercises and the likelihood for functional carryover. We often will prescribe exercises like static standing or walking exercises and encourage you to really think about it or really concentrate in a very peaceful and quiet room. But the reality is that's not real life, and balance issues occur more when you're multitasking or dual tasking. Maybe you're walking and turning your head, or maybe walking and talking. But those are the situations when falls often happen. So those are the situations and the types of scenarios that we need to be working on in order to improve balance. And I'll give you guys a second or two if you want to chat in any other situations that you feel have influenced your balance. Okay. So briefly, and actually I might let Rob kind of chime in. You guys can read the slide, but Rob's the expert in this area. Truly, you guys are very privileged to be listening to him speak tonight about dual tasking and multitasking in standing and walking, and kind of the research that's coming out about that with respect to balance. So Rob, do you mind chiming in and giving us your knowledge?
Of course, and I will say one thing. I'm truly the one who's privileged to be able to do what I do and work with people who have multiple sclerosis day in and day out. It's the most rewarding aspect of the job. So one of the things that we've been doing a lot is looking at what happens to walking or balance when you have individuals simultaneously do a cognitive task. And we call this cognitive motor interference. That is, when you're trying to do a motor task and you add a cognitive task to it, it interferes with your motor performance. And what we show in both upright standing as well as walking is that when people start doing a cognitive task while they're standing up or while they're walking, it greatly affects their performance. So when people are standing, it makes them sway a lot more. And when they're walking, it slows them down considerably, and it changes their gait in such a way that it looks like they're more unstable and potentially at risk for falling. And so we've been doing a lot of this research. We've recently shown that, and we're writing up these data right now, that people with MS don't necessarily do worse at this walking and talking task than does the general population, which is quite surprising. But it requires much more activation of the front part of their brain to do this. So to be able to perform at the same level as someone who doesn't have multiple sclerosis, they have to activate much more of their brain. And in doing so, they have less of their inactive brain or dedicated brain on that task to process other things. And that's possibly what is leading to the increased likelihood of falling with this. And if people are wondering what the cognitive tasks we have people do are, we have them say letters of the alphabet. But we don't just say, okay, say the alphabet starting with the letter A. We actually have them, while they're walking, start saying every other letter of the alphabet starting with the letter M. So they're starting in the middle of the alphabet. And when we do this, what we notice is that this increases the risks of falling. And so I'll let Mandy talk a little bit more about falling.
Thanks, Rob. So fall risk considerations. I'm just going to briefly, because a whole other separate talk could be about falls. So falls aren't occurring when we're concentrating on our balance. You know, they're generally we hear about falls rather in the clinic, and I hear this from clients and their families, that they're occurring in dark or dim light. They're occurring when people are walking and talking. They're occurring when they're changing directions, or they're turning their head too quickly, or maybe walking on an uneven surface. So they're happening in these really dynamic situations. So as a therapist, we have to make sure that when we're prescribing exercises for balance, that we're starting to encourage or tease out those challenges to hopefully nibble away at those challenges and hopefully make those situations less difficult. So let's talk about some of those examples here. Some balance exercise ideas. Again, identifying and explaining to the PT when your balance is compromised can help us problem solve when and how and in what way we need to prescribe a balance exercise program. So some examples: counting, reading, doing a crossword or jigsaw puzzle as you're in, like maybe standing on a piece of foam, or maybe sitting on an exercise ball. That's awesome. So I'm suspecting for many of you these examples might look familiar. So the balance board, the foam cushion, the lower right-hand corner is an example of a vestibular exercise or a gaze stabilization exercise. But again, you know, consult with that PT. Let them help you figure out what the best options are for you. So we'll start into cardiopulmonary and aerobic exercise. But I think due to limited time, we're going to go through these relatively quickly, as Rob's done a great job of commenting on aerobic exercise and its contribution to cognition already in previous slides. So I'm going to go over to the real life application. So the frequency is what we recommend. Again, general guidelines, 3 to 4 sessions a week, minimal. We recommend it to get in that aerobic zone, that you're at 60 to 85% of your maximal heart rate, and that's the calculation for that. That's actually 220 minus your age. Now often people are on medications that can change their heart's effect to exercise, so we actually encourage a different scale. We use a rate of perceived exertion scale, which is a 0 to 10 scale. And then those, the numbers, so like for example, 0 is if you're doing no exercise at all, you're just sitting on the couch. And 10 is, oh my gosh, I can't exercise any harder, please take me to the ER. There's a spectrum of how hard you should be working. So that I'll show you that rating of perceived exertion scale on the next slide. But the recommended durations are 20 to 30 minutes, or 2 sets of 10 to 15 minute sessions. Now I have a lot of folks who don't start there. Some folks I start at 3 to 5 minutes. You know, remember that these are goals. These are numbers to aspire for, so please don't feel like you can't participate in aerobic exercise if you're not able to achieve that 20 to 30 minute threshold. So there's that rating of perceived exertion scale. 0, nothing. 10 is maximal effort. And then how can we translate this into real life? So some aerobic training ideas. There were a number of comments in the chat box earlier about limitations to mobility and options for aerobic exercise. So I have a lot of folks who do the seated arm bike, which is the middle picture, or the pedal exerciser, which is the far right picture, that can be actually sat on the floor or sat on a table. It's very affordable, usually between $20 to $30. And Walmart was where I cited that picture. You can set it on a table and you can use that to get some aerobic exercises using an arm bike. I have a number of patients who I recommend like seated boxing or like seated jazzercise. So there are lots of creative options for getting some aerobic exercise if your mobility is slightly limited. Again, brainstorm and collaborate with a PT and help problem solve some options that are best for you. So you don't know what you don't know. So what do we still have yet to know? Rob?
The quest has just begun. So I want to tell you that kinesiologists, physical therapists, exercise scientists are working with cognitive neuroscientists, brain scientists to understand how lifestyle factors such as physical activity and cognitive reserve influence the central nervous system, that is the structure and function of the brain, and how that translates into improvements in cognition, and how maybe that also influences mobility and cognitive mobility interactions. We are at the point in time where I would say in the next 5 years, if not markedly sooner, we will be generating a body of research that addresses this major problem with people with MS. And I think if I were hedging my bet, I would bet that we're going to find substantial benefits of exercise training to improve cognition in MS, and that it might even be beneficial if you add exercise training with other cognitive rehabilitation strategies like some of the people have mentioned in the chat room, and get even bigger and better effects. So the gauntlet has been thrown down, the quest has begun, and scientists are working really hard to address this issue. So one of the things, we have lots of questions that remain. What is the ideal type of exercise? How much exercise? When is the ideal time to intervene? And there are a lot of individualization that occurs. I think one of the most important things that I want to emphasize that I saw some comments on is that you always have to listen to your body when you're engaging in exercise. Your body will tell you when it's done enough and when you need to back off. And there's no benefit to the age-old saying, no pain, no gain. If you start to experience pain, you're going to negate the gains and you need to back off. And everybody who has come into my research lab over the last 13 years, and I would estimate that that's 2,000 to 3,000 individuals, has heard me say that. Listen to your body. Listen to your body. Listen to your body. It'll tell you when you're doing the right amount of exercise and when you're not. And I think more than anything else that we find out here about the type, frequency, duration, is always remember that you can only do what your body will let you do. But hopefully over time, we can push that to help you get more and more benefit with exercise in people with MS. So the final thoughts are, we know at the very least aerobic exercise is associated with improving your brain health and improving cognition, and we are showing that this is the case in people with MS. So you can exercise to improve your brain health. You have the power to do it. You can do it. And there are lots of programs out there to help you do it, and lots of resources, and certainly Can Do MS has plenty of resources to help you along the way.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Mandy and Rob, for a very informative presentation looking at not only how and why cognitive issues appear, especially with people in MS, but some practical ways that we can protect our brain and hopefully face these cognitive challenges. So thank you guys so much. We are running a little bit behind time, so I think we maybe can do 2 or 3 questions. These questions will be available on our archived webinar on our website, www.mscando.org. And actually the first question that we received from a lot of people involved getting a copy of these slides. And as soon as we're done here, a PDF version of all these slides will be sent to all of you. So if you missed anything, you can always go back and see those copies of the slides, and again, the archived version will be on our website, so you can always go back and check on that. So we'll just kind of go through a couple questions here, and again, I apologize that we are running short on time, but we got a few questions specifically addressing lesions on the brain and being told that there's shrinkage in the brain. So I was wondering, especially Rob, if you can maybe address those two issues, the lesions and the shrinkage, and specifically how MS is related to that and how exercise can affect that.
Right. So when we talk about shrinkage, we oftentimes use the word atrophy, or that the tissue or the volume of the brain is becoming smaller and smaller over time. And we all know what lesions are. And so we have recently published a paper on physical activity and lesions and brain atrophy in kids with multiple sclerosis. And this is a collaboration with the Children's Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto, where we showed the more physically active kids had fewer lesions, and they also had less atrophy. So certainly exercise and physical activity can help to reduce the size and number of lesions and the atrophy of the brain over time. It's a great question.
Excellent. Thank you. We also received a number of questions, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, just the difference between aerobic exercise and more passive exercises such as yoga or meditation. Could you just highlight the differences, and what would you recommend as far as the most efficient cognitive exercise routine?
So I guess I'll take that. At this point in time, the majority of research is showing that aerobic exercise is the most important form of exercise for improving cognitive functioning and lots of other functionings in people with MS. I certainly would not tell anybody, if they're actively engaged in yoga or resistance exercise, to stop doing that and to quit it. I think that would be a ridiculous suggestion, because people are doing those because they're getting some real personal benefit to them. But I would encourage them to branch out and do some aerobic exercise, because I think different types of exercise have different benefits for individuals' physiology, for their brain health, and for their brain processes.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Mandy, this will be a good question for you. One of our viewers asked, what might be some rehabilitation strategies to help with processing speed and executive function?
So I think when we chatted briefly about this, but trying to implement that type of dual tasking activity. So maybe, sometimes I have folks when we're in the clinic, and if they're doing a standing balance activity, we're having a conversation about a particular favorite recipe and how they put that together. So that's working on kind of sequencing and memory recall that would address some executive function types of ideas. Again, I just think it's emphasizing picking another cognitive task or another type of mental exercise, if you will, while you're doing a physical exercise. I even encourage some folks when they're walking on the treadmill, if you don't want to read a book, listen to a book on DVD, or do a computer game on your iPad at the same time. Sometimes like Luminosity, things like that are fun to do while you're doing another aerobic exercise. So you're getting a cognitive exercise while at the same time you're getting a physical exercise.
Excellent. We actually did have a couple people ask about Luminosity and some of these other websites. Is that something that you would recommend to improve cognitive functions?
I'll speak for this, and Rob, I'd be interested in your comment too. I can't endorse luminosity, because I don't know the specific research involved. But again, from my standpoint, it's getting that cognitive activity with the physical activity. So I don't see any harm in doing it, I guess is what my comment would be. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very fair statement to say. I would concur with Mandy. Brian, if we can for a second, there is one comment that I wanted to come back to, and that's
Excellent.
the whole issue of body temperature and exercise. And, I think that exercise and its thermogenic effects have gotten maybe too much of a bad rap. And I know that the board over here is going to light up when I say that. Because most of the research that's been done to study the effects of heating up the body on different functions of people with MS has been what I would call a passive heat. That is where you put people in these really interesting body heat suits, and you while they're just sitting there, you heat them up, or you put them in a hot water bath and you heat them up. And then they show some declines in performance, whether that's ambulation or cognition and things along those lines. Well, I think that all of us experience that same thing if we go sit in a hot tub or a really hot bath. And when you get out, you're kind of a little bit, slowed down, and both mentally and physically. We've been studying what happens with exercise-induced changes in core body temperature to cognition and mobility in people with MS. And we have data that are showing that you can have people with MS exercise these people are thermosensitive, and you can increase their core temperature by over a degree centigrade, and you don't see any problems with cognition. In fact, their cognition improves, and you don't see any walking problems whatsoever. So I think, and I can see the board starting to light up over here, I think we need to know more about exercise-related changes in core body temperature and what those are doing to people with MS before we go too strong in making these statements that be careful with exercise because it'll heat you up and cause a lot of problems.
Excellent advice. Thank you for adding that, Rob. Really appreciate both Mandy and Rob, as well as all of you for participating tonight. If you do have more questions, Can Do MS has a program on our website, www.mscando.org, called Ask the Can Do Team, and you can submit a question, and one of our MS experts will answer your question for you. So if you do have some more questions about exercise or cognition, please feel free to take advantage of that program. We also have all of our archived webinars, as well as some great library articles. Mandy actually wrote an article about exercise and cognition associated with tonight's webinar. So that is available on our website. And I also want you to make aware of a couple of resources from the National MS Society. They publish a wide range of literature, including exercise as part of everyday life. And you can access this brochure on the MS Society's website. And I also encourage you to watch the Society's video on mood and cognition in MS, which would be a great supplement to tonight's presentation. I also want to make you aware of a fundraiser that Can Do MS is running across the country. It's the only national event series that combines skiing and fundraising to empower people with MS. With 7 events located at the nation's top ski resorts, Vertical Express features on-mountain and off-race skiing activities for people of all ages and abilities. And all the proceeds go to Can Do MS's programs, including our webinar and telelearning series. And speaking of which, our next presentation in our series will be on Tuesday, February 9th at the same time, 8 p.m. Eastern. The topic will be Navigating Career Change, Working with MS is Possible. So I know employment issues are very important to people, and this will actually be the first of a 4-part series that we'll be running in collaboration with the National MS Society. So please join us from the comfort of your home at no cost to you on February 9th, and as always, you can register for our webinars on our website, www.mscando.org. For